Data is power. Combining business data with learning data is the only way, there's no other way to prove the effectiveness of learning and to prove that you're generating revenue and how much. You have to get business data and training data together. And so integration is the only way to make that happen.
And that's what's on my mind. I'm Harold, and this is my Curious Corner. Hey, John, very excited to have you on the podcast. It feels a little bit like a homecoming. I've been a fanboy of Talented Learning for years, listening to the Talented Learning Show and all of your blogs. So very excited to flip the script a little bit and be the interview host here for a second. So thanks so much for joining me.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. Really excited to be on the other side of the mic. It doesn't happen very often. So thanks for asking.
And you've been in this space now for quite a while, John. I saw that you're in the army and you've gone down a little bit of the sales route, and now for quite a while with Talented Learning Show. How have you kind of seen things ebb and flow in the external learning market for the past few years here?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I tripped in to extended enterprise learning 30 years ago, and I haven't left. I've been in the center of learning technology space and extended enterprise space since then. The ebbs and flows is that it's always been there for 30 years. What hasn't been there is anybody talking about it. And so for the first 15 years of my career, it was just happened around. Groups performing on themselves, organizations were trying to make employee LMSs work. And it just kind of happened in the background. And since I started Talented Learning, I tried to bring that to the forefront and just keep on telling stories about extended enterprise learning. And not just because of us, but now in 2025, 2026, when this airs, most likely it's hard to find an organization that's not training their customers or their partners and using that as a core strategy. And so it's not so much an ebb and flow as nothing to something across 30 years.
I was chatting to Dave Darrington as part of this series, and with C-Lab and the manifesto they released, it feels like customer education or external learning have gone from something that SaaS companies did to a real revenue driver across many different industries. How have you kind of seen this be coming out of tech companies, but now being really table stakes for different industries?
Well, it certainly has in the last 15 years being really driven out of tech companies, but it's been broader than that across the longer horizons. Other industries have gone first at other points. But I think why tech companies and software companies and SaaS companies are the leaders now is because it's so ingrained in their business. Every organization, software organization, is onboarding new clients, is trying to attract new clients, has to support them over time, has new features and products they're trying to roll out. And they're trying to drive up adoption rates and reduce churn and increase lifetime value. And all those things have just made it germane to their organization that it's not something on the side. It is part of the business strategy to be able to scale and scale rapidly. And so that's why they're the poster child for customer education. But just about every other industry still has the exact same challenges, maybe not as rapid of a pace, but they still have it, whether you're making medical devices or x-ray machines or robotics or mining equipment, all these different things. You need to train your partners, your resellers to sell, to service your customers on how to use to drive all the exact same benefits that they're enjoying and trying to drive inside of SaaS and software companies. But the key of no matter what industry it is, if it's tied to revenue, that's where customer education takes off.
And another aspect of this, I think, is the maturity of these strategies are evolving dramatically from, okay, I want to train someone on one particular course to I want to run ecosystems of content in multimodality and multi-channel and, targeting much more sophisticated audiences. So I'm curious to kind of get your take on this. We're seeing things like headless learning really take off, really coming from the idea that people don't want to go to learning systems anymore. They want to have it meet them where they are. How are you kind of seeing the level of this ecosystems get more complicated, and how are you kind of exploring headless learning as a concept?
I think how I look at maturity with customer education is certainly as you describe, is it just like one course to a lot of folks, and that's where you start off. But another way to look at it, or does it get to, super hairy and complex and you got 40 different products and, 30 different countries and you have to manage all those interrelations. And so both sides and everything in between exists. But that's more of the complexity of your organization than your maturity. Maturity in customer education, I think, starts at delivering training and measuring things like the amount of courses, the amount of logins, engagement levels, scores on your tests, if you have tests, things that training people and instructional designers and customer education departments care a whole lot about. Unfortunately, nobody else cares at all. That's the beginning maturity. The end maturity, or the next step, is when you start tying it to things that are in the business. Reducing cost is probably the easiest one. Less calls to the customer support center, increased customer satisfaction, increased renewal rates. Those are kind of things in the middle that are, after you're worried about training, now you're saying, okay, how is it impacting the business? And that's middle maturity. And that's where a lot of organizations are. If you think of a bell curve, they're starting to tie it to business metrics. But when you tie it to cost savings, that's great. But what do you do for me next year? And so that doesn't make your team indispensable because it has a diminishing return on cost savings. You can only cut so much. So the next level of maturity, and this is where it gets fun, and this is where it's the most strategic, is when the efforts are tied to revenue. Can I get increase my pipeline? Are we selling more? How much more? Faster? Why? And tying every one of these metrics to an impact on the business, not just on cost savings, but on revenue. And that's the maturity of organizations. And then inside that maturity level, whether you're developing one course or you got the 30 countries scenario, it's still the same thing. Are you tracking training progress or are you tracking business progress? And if you're tracking business progress, well, that's where customer education shines and where it's really different than employee learning, where you never get to that. You're almost always on measurement of training stats and not on business stats. And that's what's fun and exciting about customer education, because a learning professional gets to be driving a strategic part of the business, the most strategic part of the business, driving revenue.
I think using a football or American football analogy, employee learning is a little bit more like playing defense, reducing risk, reducing complexities, making sure that we're staying clear to the organizational goals, the rules, often driven from HR, IT, more ops teams. Customer education, all about growth. Offense, how can you add more growth? How can you, through learning, find different metrics that you're looking at here? So you said most organizations are in the middle of that bell curve. Are you seeing the majority of organizations move along their maturity model more over time? Think of things like AI and other trends. We'll get into the headless bit here in a second, but are you seeing people move along that bell curve, or are you still feeling like people are stuck kind of in that earlier maturity stage?
Well, they were stuck in that earlier maturity stage for a lot of years because there wasn't any thought leadership content about it. And so, we tried to change that, but it's not just us. I mean, the vendor community, the consultant community, what you're doing on your podcast and inviting different organizations. As the story gets out and more organizations tell their story of their progress through the maturity, it helps all the organizations and all of us that are a step behind. And to get to that next step, whether that next step is moving into the beginning of the bell curve, the middle, or, going to maturity. But the nice thing is that professionals now are moving from organization to organization like they do in every industry and professional. So it's not like you have to reinvent the wheel if you go to a new organization. You might get there and you realize, okay, we're at maturity level, novice, but I already know how to get to maturity level, revenue, but I just got to take this organization through the stages. Before you had to teach everybody how to go through the stages. Now, a lot of people know as they move to organizations, and the idea of a customer education professional is a real career, that exists out in the industry right now. And so I think to answer your question, yes, they're progressing along. And I think, yes, every day they're progressing a little bit faster as they don't have to reinvent everything.
I think also a lot of customer education professionals are finding their tribe or community. You have customer education org and other ways that people are connecting outside of the traditional norms of, you're my company, so I know you. So there's all of these networks being built of customer education professionals. And at least from my experience in interviewing different people, it's a very proactive and positive area where people want each other to succeed and are thinking of customer education or wider external learning almost as a movement of professionals working rather than I just want to focus on me. So it feels like a lot of people are sharing knowledge. And this is a big change, I think, how it's been from 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting when organizations think of extended enterprise learning. The only people that know the term extended enterprise are professionals that come from the learning industry. And that's because you're training your employees and now you're extending this learning to these external, secondary, maybe important audiences, but they're secondary. Your focus is coming at it from employee learning. That's for my education, instructional designer. I'm coming at it from employee development. And I move my way into these external audiences and their customer education. But if an organization doesn't do that, customer education and partner education still happens. It just happens without L&D. And so the owners of the groups that have the need of attracting more customers or onboarding them or training them better or turning them into advocates, the ones that are measured on the success of that go out, either buy their own system or build their own system, build their own content, and do it independently. And what was really curious is that all the organizations in the world, not all of them, but all the organizations in the world that came at it from that angle, from the business side, they didn't see any relation or even think there was a connection between that and the employee learning side. It never occurred to them, more or less. And so they formed their own groups. And those own groups, the most popular is SEDMA, happening on both sides of the pond. In London a couple times a year, and here in America a couple times a year, which are organizations where all these professionals found themselves and started basically creating their own logic on customer education and how it works. And all of that was without L&D. And what's interesting is they got a lot farther than the L&D folks did. But what's cool in the last couple of years is those two worlds are merging now, both from a vendor standpoint, both from a population standpoint. Instructional designers, learning experts are now required on the customer education side. Business experts are required on the customer education side. And so it's like the two worlds are banging together. And so it's really easy to learn from professionals when they gather like this in the organizations you mentioned and also in SEDMA. But there's not a ton of them, and there's Talented Learning is another group that does it. There's, maybe 5 or 10 now across the world that kind of focus on this. 10 years ago, there was 0. So that's what's happening. But that sharing, I think, is the most critical component because it's been happening for 30 years. Our first project that we did 30 years ago, we created CD learning on CD-ROMs, and we sent those out to the customers at Unisys, which was making server products at the time, to educate their current customers on the new server lines that they were having on CD-ROMs before the internet, more or less. So this isn't new. It just hasn't been shared.
Yeah, as part of this deep dive series on customer education, I'm doing a panel where I'm interviewing certain SEDMA members and also chatting to Debbie, diving really deep into certification. How do you get started with it? What's the difference of badging versus certification, proctoring, all of that good stuff. Wanted to focus a little bit on the vendor perspective there you mentioned, John. So the world of employee learning and let's call it extended enterprise or external learning are converging. When you're speaking with organizations or you're building tenders or consulting, are you then recommending that they get, let's call it a generalist learning system versus a specialist? Or as with everything, it depends on their organizational context and goals. But if both teams are looking, do you find that vendors who can span both camps are typically the ones that are succeeding?
Our firm, as our core business, we help organizations buy learning systems, doing it strategically and starting with their business goals and what they're really trying to change in their organization and working that up from what are the use cases, who are the stakeholders, and then what are the functional and technical and integration and service requirements, even license requirements that align with everything that they need to do now and in the future. And once you go through all that work, and that typically takes, a month or so to collect all that information and 10 or 20 hours of discovery, once you come through all that work, you have the subset or the whole set of the requirements, and that leads you in different directions. And so if it is just that case where the customer education is going all by themselves and they don't have to worry about any of the employee stuff or any of the other stuff, that's a different set of requirements than an organization that wants to look at it holistically and say, I have 3 audiences or more, a couple different types of partners, a couple different types of customers and my employee audiences, But guess what? All of them have a similar need on proprietary content, on the content about our products, our services, and how to buy and sell and service. All of those groups have that common need. So if you look at it holistically, then there's economies in scale as an organization holistically, not just in the content development, but just tying this different silos together for better business horsepower, better business performance. When that is the case, then the generalists shine. Organizations that are experts on all the pieces, and more importantly, all the pieces working together. Customers will almost always buy, they're not generalists. They're experts in making those pieces work together. They just happen to be generalists in the sense that they can do a lot because they're mature. But sometimes you don't need a lot. Sometimes you need less. And sometimes you just need something really targeted to what you do. And in those cases, there's smaller specialists out there that are often attractive for the different micro use cases that exist out there. And it might be attractive to buyers, especially if they're looking at their particular use case and not broader than that. And they don't need to look broader than that. That gives them a different level of flexibility. So the short answer is every organization is different, and it's based on those requirements and what they're trying to do. And if you go through that right process of thinking about your requirements from business goals forward, it'll lead you to different places in the marketplace, and it should.
What I find is quite interesting, John, is imagine three different buckets. You have learning teams, so say internal, external. Someone comes to them, hey, can we have a course on X? You do the same kind of performance consulting questioning. What do we want to achieve? What needle are we looking to move? Then you do when you're going into an organization, or that vendor does. If people are coming to me, I want to be really transparent on where the product succeeds and where it doesn't. So if you're very early stage and you're only looking at a small niche audience, I'm going to give you the recommendation of the partners that, I think is going to hit your mark. And then if you're actually growing to a point where, okay, actually this product is going to be helpful, they'll come back. So there's been so many times where people come to me and say, actually, you should check out this. And this is when we are going to be the right product for you. So it's almost like buying a car or buying a house. There are different times where systems make sense for organizations. So it must be an interesting position to kind of own that roller deck as a consultancy, because there's so many vendors and there's so much differentiation going on between the vendors as well.
Yeah, there really is. So when I started my career, I spent 14 years of my career selling enterprise learning management systems for two providers. I used to have a slide that I put up. It was a market share slide, which you can't do anymore. And it's a market share slide of the 100% pie of like each of the vendors. And there were 16 vendors on it. I used that slide or variations of it for close to a year, or close to a decade rather, 10 years. And because that's all there was. And then all of a sudden we looked around and there was 50, and then there was 100. And by the time I left that and started Talented Learning 13 years ago, there was 250 vendors. And now by our counts, we're keeping track, not daily and not with briefings on all of them, but we're aware of well over 1,000. And this year I had briefings from over 200 of them. And so I've basically are always on a mission to learn what's going on out in the marketplace and what these specialties are. And because I'm a recovering LMS sales guy, I'm always looking at it from that lens. And I have been the whole time of through every one of these briefings, my mindset is, okay, if I was a sales leader for your organization, how could I sell this? Who would I sell it to? Who would care about this? What is the differentiation? And what use cases care about that? And where would I position that? And that's how I'm thinking about each one of these organizations. Over time, I run into every one of these use cases where that subspecialty is exactly what they need. And so there's 1,000 systems out there, not because they're all competing for the same thing. It's because they're all competing for something slightly different, as it turns out.
I think highlighting that difference is what I would want more vendors to do. So as an example, I was at our sales kickoff a couple of years back, and we had a presentation from Jill Scott, an author of the Radical Candor book. And I've kind of tried to take that radical candor look into a lot of the discussions with prospective customers. So they're coming and saying, hey, I'm trying to do X or I'm trying to do Y. I'm saying, just going to be really honest, we're not the best fit for you here. Like that builds trust and you give recommendations. So almost trying to take a piece of that independent playbook of how you're doing it. And I say, this is where we are a really good fit. And a lot of times people have left that organization, they've gone somewhere else and they're like, hey, I really appreciated how you actually gave honesty here. And we get into another evaluation. It's such a small world that if we're trying to sell sugar pills, imagine we're a doctor rather than holistic medicine, people will know, rumors will spread. So I think the idea of you dealing with a certain customer in a bad way, that's going to really hurt you down the line. So that people side of vendors, I think, is really important as well.
Yeah, life in general is like that. If you want to try to trick people, and I've been watching this for 30 years now, and I hear this from vendors all the time. Oh, we got everything you need. Oh, we can build that, or oh, no, 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 we'll do that for you. And all that is just like in the heat of the sales moment, and I get it, but they don't realize that this arc is really long in this career and in this field and in this profession because there's so much longevity. And now across my 30 years, that world just keeps on getting smaller. It's odd that I go a week without banging into somebody that I knew from a previous life in that 30 years. And it just keeps getting smaller. And say for talented learning, we help as organization or professionals move from organization. I help that same professional buy the next LMS and the next organization time and time again. But that's the whole idea. There is that differentiation. So when you find a client that's in your bucket of differentiation, you have to let them know in all ways possible, from how hard you're selling, how much you're tailoring the RFP, how focused that use case demonstration is, telling customer stories, getting references, because buyers buy that. They want to feel comfortable. They want to avoid that risk. And the reverse is true too. If that customer is not square in your bucket and you're not 100% that they're going to just be awesome with your system, it's really foolish to take that deal, even for revenue. It's very foolish. I like to think of it as the process that organizations follow of going through the requirements in an RFP really helps prevent that vendor amnesia down the road. Because if you actually take the time as a buyer to do it right, slow down and gather your requirements and shortlist vendors based on those requirements and solicit proposals that are apples to apples, and demonstrations that are apples to apples in terms of your actual use cases, so you can see what you're doing, not just a feature here or there, but how the features work together to achieve everything from training your customers to managing your compliance. If you go through those steps, well, then you're not surprised after contract signing. If you skip those steps, you're always surprised about that vendor that says, sure, we can do that. And so, yes, it's bad on the vendor, and yes, it's bad karma. But it's also bad on the buyer, because if that happens, in my experience, a lot of it is because they rush through the buying process. And that happens every day.
I think in the age of AI, that's another really interesting point. I read earlier today, you had a really interesting post which said that about 32% of customer education teams are experimenting, 13% plan to adopt AI, only 13 don't use it at all. But only 12% have embedded it in most of their workflow. So it feels like we're coming over that bell curve of AI adoption. And going back to what you said, be clear on the things we're solving, be clear on the use cases and what metrics we're moving towards. I feel like that's more important than ever. So we're not just shooting for the stars with an AI workflow, but it's actually tailored to the metrics we want to achieve.
AI is no different than any other feature set that comes onto the learning technology marketplace. It has to be used in a way that ties back to your business goals and the moving of that needle, whatever that is. And if you can't do that, then it's just candy. It's just sizzle. There's always a new sizzle in our industry, from XAPI to social learning to gamification to self-paced learning to micro learning to skills and competencies. There's always something, to headless, which we still haven't got around to talking about, and now to AI.
Coming back to the headless topic, I'll add a caveat up front. I said my radical candor about headless. My personal opinion, unless you have consulted with IT and you've done the due diligence that they are willing to help and they're willing to enable this project, I wouldn't recommend going down the headless route, as it is a higher technical lift. There are digital adoption platforms, or there's simpler technical lifts that can enable in-the-flow learning. And the other area where I would say I wouldn't go down to headless is if you have so many SaaS products as a company that you need to embed into like 10 or 15 interfaces, and you don't have a way to simplify that into a single interface. But assuming then that we are looking at headless and it is a good idea, How have you kind of seen clients adopt it, or how have you seen clients grapple with this idea of bringing learning where customers or partners are?
Like a lot of different terms in our industry, there is no one definition and one way to look at it. But how I look at headless and how a lot of vendors look at it and customers is that if you build your platform in a strategic way, your front end as an LMS provider, as a SaaS software provider, you're using your API level to talk to the data. And so that API level in your front end, that's the mechanism. You're eating your own dog food. You're drinking your own champagne. You're using your own APIs to pull data and display it on the user interface. That's what a normal software system does. A headless system is, for whatever reason, you can't get or configure it to display the way that you want. Or perhaps you want it to display not just that LMS information about your certifications and your upcoming training, but maybe about your pipeline, your sales pipeline, or maybe about what you have going on in other parts of the organization. So you want your learners, for one reason or another, to have a dashboard that contains information the way they want to see it, most valuable to them to do their job, and perhaps bring in external data. So you're almost creating this master cockpit for the different types of learners or users. You're still using the same functional database, the functional LMS. You're just displaying the stuff differently. That's headless in my opinion. And is it popular? Believe it or not, it's something that happened a long time ago in professional associations, which is still a thriving learning technology market. But they had things called association management systems, and they were around before LMSs. And so they had these AMSs, and then when e-learning came around, they started deploying LMSs, but they didn't want their members to go to two places. And so right from the get-go, they started combining those two and showing AMS data and LMS data in these custom front ends. And almost every association was doing this. Is like 20 years ago. The same thing is happening now again, 10, 15 years later with customer education. At first, with customer education and professional education, organizations were trying to shoehorn an employee LMS into a marketing tool. And they couldn't do it because that's not what it was designed to do. So they put their own front end in there and used the power of the LMS to serve up the content and to create something marketing and snazzy and, attention grabbing for customer learners, which are voluntary learners. You can't make them do anything. You have to encourage them and entice them to do things. Unlike your employees, like take this training or you're fired. You can't do that with your customers. So you have to use the soft touch on that. My recommendation with clients and how I look at it is, don't do it unless you have to. And if you have to, it's got to be tied to, once again, the business reason and how you're moving that needle. And if you can't do that, then it's probably overkill. And then a final point is something that's kind of different, but it was in your question, is then this learning in the flow of work. Is that the same as headless? Maybe that's the new expanded definition of headless as that term morphs, but it's essentially the same thing. You're not sending the learner to the island or to the LMS, but rather bringing that content into wherever they're at, whether that's Slack or MS Teams or even the software product that I'm using, that I'm running my whole legal firm, every aspect, of that SaaS platform. Maybe the learning's coming right in there. And though that wasn't traditionally for 20 years a definition of headless, I think in the flow of work is a form of headless also. And that is becoming more popular.
Headless, I would also define as bring your own front end. And it actually is about the code ingestion into the other application where you're decoupling the front end and back end LMS to create that new front end as you talked about. So from the clients you have seen do this successfully, what have been some of the reasons why they went headless or in the flow, to expand the definition? And how did they use technology to bring learning where people are?
The number one reason is because they couldn't get it commercially. If they could do it commercially, they would. Most organizations, because nobody wants to support custom stuff. So I think that's the number one. If an organization has their preference, even if they want to do it in the flow of work in Salesforce or HubSpot or Slack or software products or Teams, still organizations offer that out of the box now with productized integrations to be able to drive that learning everywhere. Less and less is becoming custom to do that, and more of that's good customer education learning systems know that ecosystem exists and are actively trying to make it easy to integrate into that ecosystem and leverage that data from anything from sales systems, customer support system, product system, the application itself. I had one organization on the podcast here recently that was a consulting company for big rig trucking companies, lorries. And what they did is they basically were monitoring the driving habits, giving them training about how to brake softer and how to accelerate more slowly and do a couple of things that they measure. If they do that across a large scale of these trucking fleets, they reduce things like brake replacements and gas consumption and things like that. So they're actually monitoring each driver and using how each driver interacts with that truck after the training to then drive personalized learning to them on their mobile devices or prevent them from actually getting in the truck till they take that new additional thing. And they just help these organizations around the world improve the efficiency of their fleets all in a headless manner. So there's an example of something that, but why are they doing that? Why are they worried about the iPads? These truck drivers don't have laptops. Why are they worried about getting that to them where they're at in the systems where they're at? Well, because it's tied to a business need. And that business need was to save $20 million on gas a year. That's why organizations do it. Probably two last examples here that I really seen developed out here recently is the sales, whether that's internal or channel sales, and customer support of bringing those systems with the data in the LMS and using AI that while you're on the call, while you're preparing for the sales call, while you're on the sales call, while you're following up after the sales call on your next step, what questions asked next, while you're on a customer support and using the learning that's all compiled and brought in through an AI agent. And so you're bringing your learning not only to the point in the flow of work, but literally it is the tool in the process of doing your work is leveraging all that information. And I think that's just the beginning. It's going to happen to all these different functions. It should happen to leadership functions and managerial functions and all the different functions that exist through different types of organizations to leverage that learning knowledge to be able to do things, once again, quicker, faster, cheaper. And so that's really one of the trends that's changed in how learning, I think, is going to be in the future. Is it's been this way for decades now, less and less and less of longer and longer courses and, sit for 2 weeks in a class. And it's been progressing from that to micro learning to now this is even smaller than micro learning. This is like micro learning.
I think with AI and agentic interfaces, it's so many interesting kind of innovations happening from the search and being able to get information through this agentic interfaces. And really cool example, mixing support tools in there. I think that would be a super pervasive use case for support teams or CSMs or the likes. We're also seeing actually agentic kind of marketplaces where you can deploy agents, set them up, and basically almost outsource admin to the agents. Of course, you need the right data and you need the right problems to solve here. But what I'm very passionate about is if AI can outsource some of the grunt work from admin, we can spend more time on high value activities, more human coaching, more instructor-led or virtual instructor-led. And it's moving L&D or wider customer education from admins more to the orchestrators of knowledge, which is a very cool area where I dived with a few different episodes earlier in the podcast and kind of that shift from course creators to coaches, essentially.
Interesting. And to pile on a slightly parallel topic that we were discussing earlier, here's like a perfect example of a specialist. So a specialist is an organization that focuses on customer support and customer service, and they find a new way to bring that data together with learning data to improve that customer service function. So they're doing something that's advanced in their field with advanced APIs and AIs and pulling this system and thought leadership and strategy. And the rest of the industry, the generalists, kind of look and say, that's not a bad idea, but we're not there yet. And so slowly over time, that good idea will be incorporated into the generalist as the generalist grows. But for a period of time, that buyer is in customer support and trying to solve problems in customer support, the net specialist is going to look really attractive.
I'm also curious, John, from the kind of integrations that landscape that you're seeing within, let's say, more of the mature market or the enterprise market for extended enterprise learning. We're seeing things like integrating in virtual labs or proctoring software under single contracts is a huge trend and something more and more organizations want to do because they want fewer suppliers, but doing more with that ecosystem of tools. How are you seeing things like virtual labs or proctoring or other ways of, let's say, specialist customer education tools, kind of those integrations being in more demand with learning systems?
One of the big parts of every one of my consult engagements of helping organizations buy a learning system is this definition of the ecosystem. And the only consistent thing about the customer education ecosystem is that it's not consistent. It is really different from organization to organization wise. I have to spend time uncovering it and mapping out the potential integrations that right now are driving manual. Without integration, then there's manual tasks. The work still has to get done. It's just whether somebody picks up that pile of work or it happens automatically is what integration does. Or it doesn't get done, in which case you lose effectiveness of your customer education department because you're not, optimizing what you're trying to do. But in most organizations, you see everything, the ecosystem includes CRM or partner management relationship system, SSO, virtual tools, e-commerce gateway, e-commerce shopping front, virtual labs, proctoring, custom databases, customer support system, customer service system are all potential. And each one of those categories has vendors in it. So if you say virtual classroom, well, is it Zoom? Is it MS Teams? Is it GoToWebinar? Is it CRM? Is it Salesforce? Is it HubSpot? And so you got to go through all these different pieces and link them together. But there is not a customer education deployment that I worked on that is an island. Everyone is integrated with some or all of those or more of those other LMSs or distribution systems. Oh, analytics systems. Another one, data lakes and things like that to crank all your data. All of that is super common in customer education. And it's also super common to not have all those integrations in place. That's a level of maturity. We didn't talk about that before in the maturity train, but starting off as, just one to your CRM or, almost no integration, maybe just a virtual tool to being into that network that already exists, ecosystem in your organization. And why do you want to do that? Because data is power. Combining business data with learning data is the only way, there's no other way to prove the effectiveness of learning and to prove that you're generating revenue and how much. You have to get business data and training data together. And so integration is the only way to make that happen. Politics is the second way. If I'm doing my job right, my clients are succeeding by tying these systems together. And what you see is, what you were mentioned before, less time in administration, less time on doing brainless work, and more time to be able to do the more strategic work of your organization, better content, better coaching, better mentoring, and doing things like that. So by gaining efficiencies and integrating the system, the one thing you're doing is saving on all your manual administration and allowing your team to move in the right direction. The second thing that you see is you start to see that move towards the upper maturity levels because you start to pick a metric and prove that something's working, and then pick another metric. And the next thing you know, you have 15, 20 metrics that you're measuring against and proving that it's working. And so that's what happens. The good integration allows to integrate your way to maturity and to proving your value. And it's all comes down to proving. If it's happening and you can't prove it, it's not happening. It doesn't matter in terms of when the market goes down and it's time to cut staff. If you haven't proved your impact on the business, then you're in the bucket that could get cut. And if you show that you're adding revenue, you're in the bucket that can't, or you don't want to, or it's not strategic to do that. You make yourself indispensable. So integration and combining a business data and breaking down those barriers, that's what you see in success. And that translates to personal and organizational success that is measurable. What happens when people don't follow my advice? Well, you don't get that. You still have manual processes. You're still using spreadsheets. For one reason, you can't work with IT and get this integration. But most of those reasons are usually political and not technical. And so I hope those cases are relatively rare out there where you can't break down, because typically if you approach this buying process in a thoughtful way, one of the best practices, not just going through the steps that I said, but identifying who all these stakeholders and inviting them to the table to help you define their requirements so that you can understand their challenges and restrictions and goals in terms of learning and how that can help their organization. And so it's not a surprise that these organizations are going to want to integrate with the learning system because they see benefit too, and they were at the table when they were making the decisions on what was needed. in the first place. If you go through a strategic process like that, your chances of ending up in a bad place are drastically reduced. One of the main things that drives a new LMS or a new LMS switch is just the end of a contract cycle. So you sign a contract for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And as that's coming due, it's prudent to look around. What's changed? Technology is racing, and it's prudent to look around. The number one mistake I think organizations make is they don't give themselves enough time. You need to start like 18 months before your contract expires and start doing that process of aligning your stakeholders. What has changed since the last time that you did it? Did you acquire another company that has, an XYZ LMS already, or 3 LMSs or 9 LMSs? What business priorities? What has been working and what has not? And doing that process earlier so that you can get to a short list and an RFP about a year before your contract expires. And that gives you time to go through a thoughtful buying process, really evaluate less vendors deeper, more strategically, because they're qualified so you can get to that vendor. And most importantly, to give yourself enough time to do a thoughtful transition from your old system to your new system. So what can you do to prepare? One is to give yourself the time to start going through these processes. Number two is no matter who wins, when you're moving from one house to another house, one LMS to another LMS, you got to decide what to take, what to keep, organize that. The vendor can't do that. So you just spent 3, 5 years on an LMS. You probably got content coming out your ears that nobody uses. Now's the time, not during the implementation. What do you have? What's not using? Just like when you move, it's a perfect time to throw stuff in the dumpster. Identifying your stakeholders early, that broad stakeholder group, identifying what content you have and doing an audit, determining what you're going to bring, identifying what you need to do with your data. Do I need to bring user data? How much? What's that look like? Are they active users? Do I need to bring in progress data? For how many years? Start asking those type of questions, because no matter who your new vendor is, you're going to have to do all those tasks. So start preparing for those tasks before any vendor, and as just almost separate parallel projects. And so if you do that in advance, the customers that do that always choose well and hit the ground at a full sprint.
So as a final question, John, I'm going to give you the chance to basically throw 3 things within current learning technology on the fire and bring in 3 new things that you want to see more of. The rant or the choice is yours.
I think the number one thing that I would bring in is more of a focus on business metrics and driving business metrics with learning. I've been through 4 different downturns of the market in my career, and just watching how training and development, internal or external, gets blown up in each one of those downturns, and how professionals get blown up, progress gets blown up, the departments get blown up. Everything that was achieved in learning and development seems to like fall off a cliff in an economic downturn. And then once the economy turns, it goes back the other way. And I think we can prevent that and make ourselves more indispensable by just tying ourselves to the business. The second thing I think I would like to see more of is, with this generative AI in authoring content and creating content, I want to see better instructional design. All of us, I think, have went through ChatGPT being the greatest thing, to all of us realizing that you can't trust it, without double and triple checking. And the same goes with creating content, in my opinion, all learning systems at this stage, and enforcing and driving good instructional design. Not just good instructional design like we want learning objectives, but more sophisticated than that. Like, what are we trying to teach? In good instructional design, you use different teaching methods based on whether you're trying to share knowledge or get somebody to do something. That, in my opinion, doesn't exist at all yet in this industry. So all this new generated content is really thin in terms of like its effectiveness. And so that's a phase 1 for sure. But I'd like to see that really grow, so that with each particular piece of content now, we're measuring the effectiveness of the instructional design, which leads to whether it's moving the business needle or not. I think the third thing is just a return to simple. The more powerful any system is, the more powerful an admin, the people that use the system, need to be to use that effectively. I think the answer to that is really these agentic agents for administrators. And I'd like to see more of that to reduce this administrative burden. which with LMSs, that's the whole point of the origination of this. And I think reducing that burden is like what we talked about before, is it gives you the ability to do all the other things. I like to see less of product pitches and more of organizations, vendors of solving business goals.
We could talk about this for hours and hours, but I've really appreciated your time. As I said, I've been a fan of your work for years. So
Thank you.
I'll link that to everyone in the episode here. And if you are passionate about customer education, work with John and set up a proper process and make sure that you're tackling this in the right way. Not 3 months before, maybe closer to 18th ideally. But thank you so much for your time today, John.
Outstanding. Thanks for inviting me. I love talking shop like this. Really exciting. And listeners, hope you found value today. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. So that's it for this conversation. I'm going to keep going down rabbit holes as we explore the weird and wonderful world of learning and development. If you want my full wrap up and takeaways, subscribe to my newsletter where I'll connect all the dots.